In 1900, Charles Parham returned to Topeka, Kansas and opened a Bible school called Bethel Bible School. He was the principal teacher. In fact, the only teacher, and the Bible was the textbook. Just before Christmas in 1900, he gave his students an assignment. He asked them to find out if there was any Bible evidence for baptism of the Holy Spirit. They were to look in the book of Acts or wherever they could find it in the Bible and report back to him. And so when he returned from a preaching engagement, the students reported that the book of Acts suggested or implied that people who received the baptism of the Spirit spoke in other tongues as the Spirit gave utterance. And so with that kind of background, they had a watch night service in 1900 as it turned into 1901. During that watch night service, a woman named Agnes Osmond received the baptism of the Spirit, allegedly spoke in Chinese for hours, and that really is often considered to be the birthplace, the event that launches the modern Pentecostal movement. Women have played an incredibly important part. Not only was Agnes Osmond the first to receive the baptism of the Spirit in the 20th century, but Parham's wife, Sarah, and his sister-in-law, Lillian Thistlethwaite, were key players in the early movement. And as they moved from Topeka to Joplin and then down to Houston, was a sister hall that was critically important to the spreading of the Pentecostal message. And when the message moved west to Azusa Street, the famous Azusa Street revival, there were a number of key women in that mission. William Seymour, the founder of the Azusa Street Mission, married Jenny Evans Moore, and she became a preacher. And on the early board, there are some pictures of the early leadership team of the Azusa Street Mission, and women were included. And many women missionaries went out from Azusa Street kind of around the world, spreading the message of the baptism of the Spirit. To put that in context, one must understand that at this juncture in the history of the United States, women didn't have a right to vote. It wasn't until 1920 that the 19th Amendment was ratified that gave women a right to vote. So the first 20 years of Pentecostal history, many women were involved in ministry. In fact, the earliest list that we have of PAW, which is an early oneness organization, includes almost a third of the people on that list as credentialed ministers would be female. So if you look at the roots of Pentecostalism, and probably it's wrapped up in this idea that the Spirit is poured out on all flesh. When Peter stood up in the day of Pentecost trying to explain what had happened earlier that day in the upper room, he referred back to a Old Testament prophet named Joel, from Joel chapter 2, verse number 28, who promised that one day the Spirit would be poured out on all flesh, and your sons and your daughters would prophesy. And Peter repeats that message, kind of explains what the phenomena that's just happening in the day of Pentecost, or just happened on the day of Pentecost, and puts it in terms of this is that spoken of by the prophet Joel, sons and daughters. So if the Spirit could empower people to speak in tongues, and it would empower women. When women were born of the Spirit, they spoke in tongues and prophesied like men did. It stands to reason, following that logic, the logic of the Spirit is that women would be involved in ministry, even in the preaching ministry. So from the first 50 years of the Pentecostal movement, women played a critical role in the spreading of the gospel and the development of the Pentecostal message. They evangelized. They certainly were missionaries. In fact, a number of single women went to China and established missions in China. And they pastored. They started missions. They started churches. You can't tell the Pentecostal story without telling the place of women in ministry in that story.